It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where time seems to stretch, and the world slows down just enough for you to catch your breath. Mia sat on the sidewalk near the park, her hands resting gently on the ground as she watched a couple of birds flutter by. She wasn't bothered by the usual chatter of children running and laughing in the distance. Her mind was in a different place. The sunlight cast soft shadows on her face, and she tried to lose herself in the calmness of it all. But it was a false peace, one that would soon shatter. From the corner of her eye, she saw the familiar flash of red and blue lights. 2 police cars pulled up, blocking the little path that led deeper into the park. Mia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't used to seeing police officers in her neighborhood. She felt a sudden wave of discomfort ripple through her. Her disability often made her feel different, and having anyone stare at her in such a vulnerable state only intensified that feeling. She was just waiting for her mom to pick her up after school, nothing more. She had no reason to be nervous, but the presence of those cars made her tense. The officers stepped out, their shoes crunching the gravel as they approached. Mia's stomach twisted into knots. They didn't seem to notice her at first, talking among themselves as they walked closer. But then, one of them turned his gaze directly at her, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone not unkind, but firm. Mia froze, caught off guard. Was he talking to her? She looked up, meeting his eyes, trying to process the question. She felt her breath catch in her throat. There was nothing unusual about what she was doing. She was just waiting, as she always did. But in that moment, everything felt wrong. I'm waiting for my mom," she said softly, her voice barely audible as she struggled to find the right words. She shifted uncomfortably, trying to make herself smaller, just hoping the situation would pass. But the officer didn't move. "You shouldn't be out here alone. Do you know that?" he pressed, taking a step closer. The other officer stood behind him, arms crossed, watching without speaking. Mia could feel the weight of their eyes on her, making her heart race. She tried to explain, but the words didn't seem to come out right. Her mind raced, but all that came out was a quiet, "I'm fine." The officer, however, wasn't listening. "Do you have any identification?" he asked, his voice sharp now, as though the encounter was taking a turn she didn't expect. Mia's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her pocket for the small ID her mom had given her. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she didn't want to get into trouble. Her mind raced. Was she doing something wrong? Was she not allowed to sit here, alone, in public? She handed the officer the card, her fingers shaking. The officer took it, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he kept his eyes on her, his expression hardening. The second officer, silent until now, stepped forward and scanned the area, noticing the growing number of people who were watching. She felt their eyes on her too, but it wasn't comforting. They were all looking, some with curiosity, others with judgment. A few murmurs floated through the crowd, but no one spoke up. Not a single person came forward to ask if Mia was okay or needed help. It felt like she was the only one who saw how surreal the moment was, as if she were trapped in a bad dream. The officers exchanged a look before turning back to her. "You should move along," the first officer said again, his voice now more commanding. "It's not safe to be out here by yourself." "But I'm not alone. My mom is coming," Mia said, her voice rising slightly, a mix of confusion and fear in her words. Her mom would be there soon. She knew that much. But even in her small, shaky protest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The officers seemed determined to make her feel small, to make her feel out of place. Without waiting for a response, the first officer placed a hand on his radio, his fingers lingering for a moment. Mia's pulse quickened. She felt her body grow rigid, her disability suddenly feeling like a weight. It wasn't just her body that was vulnerable. She felt exposed, like an easy target in the middle of an interrogation. What could they possibly want from her? What was happening? Was this how things were supposed to be? And then, a shadow fell across the scene, drawing all eyes toward the street. The crowd parted, and there she was, Mia's mother, rushing toward her, panic in her eyes as she saw the officers standing there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she closed the distance, her voice breaking the silence. "What's going on here? Why are you questioning my daughter?" Her voice was full of anger and fear, but Mia also saw something else there, something stronger. It was determination. Mia had never seen her mother this way, and something inside her stirred, a flicker of hope. Would her mom be able to fix this? Would she be able to stand up for her, like she always told her to do? The officers turned to face Mia's mother, but the air was different now. The tension between them was palpable. Mia could feel it in her chest, as though the entire situation had changed in the blink of an eye. But what came next? Mia couldn't know yet, but her heart skipped a beat, waiting for the next move to unfold. Mia's mother reached her daughter's side, her heart racing with concern. She didn't hesitate for a second. Her arms reached out to pull Mia close, the comfort of her touch like a shield against the growing storm. The officers were momentarily taken aback by the sudden appearance of someone with authority, a mother who wouldn't let her child be treated like this. For a moment, everything was still. The crowd of onlookers seemed to hold their breath, as though waiting to see what would happen next. Mia's mother stood tall, despite the storm of emotions crashing inside her, her hands clenched into fists, not out of anger, but out of the deep protective instinct that surged through her when she saw anyone, let alone her own daughter, treated unjustly. The officers looked at her, their faces unreadable, their posture tense. But there was something in her gaze, something that made them falter. Maybe it was the fierce love in her eyes, or maybe it was the realization that they had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But the moment stretched on, heavy with unspoken words. "Why are you talking to my daughter like that?" Mia's mother demanded, her voice steady, but filled with an edge of disbelief. She wasn't sure if she was asking for an explanation or simply stating the truth, but it didn't matter. The officers seemed to be calculating how they could shift the situation, their expressions now shifting from certainty to uncertainty. The first officer, the one who had been the most forceful, looked over at his partner, as if searching for reassurance, or maybe even an excuse. "She was just sitting out here alone," he said, his voice losing some of its original authority. "It's not safe for kids to be unsupervised. We were making sure she was okay." Mia's mother didn't buy it. She knew what was happening here. It wasn't concern for Mia's safety. It was something else entirely. She had seen this kind of behavior before, heard stories of young girls, especially those with disabilities, being treated like they didn't matter. "My daughter was waiting for me," she said, her words clear and firm. "And she's not some kind of threat to you. So if you don't mind, we'll be on our way. You're done here." But the officer didn't back down. Instead, he seemed to double down on his stance. "It's not just about her being out here," he muttered, though Mia could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He shifted his weight, glancing at the crowd of bystanders who were now openly watching, their phones raised to capture the scene. "We need to make sure she's not causing trouble." Mia's heart sank. The words felt like a slap to her already fragile sense of self-worth. She wasn't causing trouble. She was just a girl sitting on a sidewalk, waiting for her mother, something anyone else might do without a second thought. She looked up at her mother, seeking her strength, and saw the same quiet fury that had always protected her, the same resilience she'd inherited from the woman who'd raised her. Mia's mother reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Mia, don't listen to them," she whispered, as if reminding her daughter that none of this was her fault. "You're not in trouble. You haven't done anything wrong." The crowd had grown, and whispers were spreading through the people who had gathered. Some were watching quietly. Others were starting to voice their concerns. "Hey, leave the kid alone," one man called out from the crowd, his voice low but firm. "What's the problem here?" Another woman spoke up. "I've seen her around. She's harmless. Why are you harassing her?" Mia's heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else. something that had begun to blossom inside her chest. The crowd was speaking up, standing with her and her mother. It wasn't just the two of them now, but a growing sense of unity among those who had witnessed this injustice. For the first time that day, Maya felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone, not anymore. But the officers, realizing the situation was quickly slipping from their control, exchanged another look. The second officer, the quieter one who had been observing, seemed to hesitate for a moment. He shifted his gaze between Mia's mother and the bystanders. Mia could see his shoulders tense, as though he was trying to figure out what to do next. His partner, the first officer, seemed to want to escalate the situation further, but the growing opposition around them made it more difficult to proceed with force. The air was thick with the tension of a situation that was on the verge of exploding, and the longer it went on, the more uncomfortable it became. The officer with the radio lifted his hand, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. He was about to speak when Maya's mother took a step forward, her voice ringing out with the kind of authority that demanded to be heard. "You don't get to intimidate my daughter. And you don't get to intimidate me," she said, her voice rising with conviction. "We're leaving. You can either let us go, or we can take this to the precinct. Your choice." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Mia's eyes locked on her mother's, and she saw something there, something she hadn't realized before. This wasn't just about the officers. This was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Mia could feel the weight of her mother's words, the strength that had been building in her all this time. Her mother had always told her to stand tall, to believe in herself, and now she was living that advice. The officers exchanged another glance, this time one of hesitation, and for a brief moment, it seemed like they were considering backing down. The second officer sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. The first officer looked around at the now growing crowd, his posture shifting from authoritative to uncertain. It was clear that the pressure of being watched, the weight of the community's scrutiny, had forced a shift. The situation was unraveling, and it was clear that Maya's mother had won this small, powerful victory. Without another word, the first officer took a step back, his expression now conflicted. He glanced at his partner, who nodded slowly. And then, just like that, they turned and walked away, without any further apology, without any acknowledgement of the harm they had caused. As they disappeared down the street, Mia's mother stood tall, her heart still pounding but filled with pride. She looked down at her daughter, her eyes softening with a mixture of relief and love. "Let's go home, sweetie," she said gently, and Mia could hear the strength in her voice, the quiet triumph. Mia nodded, a quiet smile breaking across her face as she stood up. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid. She was proud. Proud of her mother, proud of herself, and proud of the community that had stood with her. As Mia and her mother began to walk away from the scene, a soft breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees above them. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but the weight of the moment still lingered. The crowd had started to disperse, some still murmuring among themselves, others shaking their heads, but all of them had witnessed something important. Mia could feel the eyes of the onlookers following them as they walked, but instead of feeling small or exposed, she felt a surge of something new, something she couldn't quite name yet, but something powerful all the same. Her mother's hand was warm around hers, a steadying presence in the midst of what had just happened. Maya's thoughts were still swirling, trying to process everything that had unfolded in such a short amount of time. What had started as a routine day, just waiting for her mom to pick her up from school, had turned into something far more significant, something that would stay with her for a long time. Mia's mind replayed the moment when her mother had stepped in, her voice strong and unwavering. For the first time in her life, Maya saw her mom not just as a protector, but as a force of nature, a woman who refused to let anyone, not even the police, walk all over her daughter. Mia had always known her mother was brave, but this was different. This was something more than just bravery. It was courage. It was standing up in the face of something unjust, even when it was scary, even when it felt like the world was stacked against you. As they walked in silence, Mia couldn't help but think about how different things could have gone. What if her mother hadn't arrived in time? What if no one had spoken up from the crowd? What if those officers had pushed even harder, made her feel even smaller, even more powerless? The thought made Maya's chest tighten, but it also made her realize just how important it was to have someone stand by you when things went wrong. She had always been told by her mom to stand up for herself, to be brave. But today, Maya learned what it meant to have someone who would stand with you, no matter what. They arrived at their apartment, the familiar scent of dinner cooking wafting through the door as they stepped inside. The calmness of home felt different now. There was an underlying sense of pride in the air, a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed today. Maya's mother didn't speak at first. She simply hung up her coat, her face thoughtful as she moved about the kitchen, preparing the meal. Maya stood in the doorway, still trying to wrap her mind around everything. It felt like the world had shifted on its axis, and she wasn't sure if she was still standing on the same ground. But then her mother turned to her, a small smile on her face, her eyes soft with that same warmth that had protected Mia her entire life. "You know," her mother began, "I'm proud of you today." Mia blinked, not fully expecting the words. "Why?" Her mother set down the knife she had been holding and walked over to where Mia stood. She placed her hands on her shoulders and looked her straight in the eye. "Because you stood tall. You didn't let them make you feel less than you are. And I want you to remember that, Mia. You are never less than anyone. You are worthy of respect, of dignity, of kindness, no matter who tries to take that from you." Mia felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at her mother. Those words, coming from her, meant more than anything. Mia had heard them before, but today they hit differently. She had never understood the full weight of what it meant to stand up for herself, not really. But now, after everything that had happened, it felt like a lesson she'd never forget. That night, as they sat down to dinner together, there was a sense of quiet resolve in the air. Mia's mom didn't need to say anything more. They both understood that today had been a turning point, not just for Mia, but for both of them. It wasn't just about standing up to the police. It was about learning to stand up for what was right, even when the world seemed against you. In the days that followed, things slowly began to return to normal. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she had changed. She started noticing more, the way people treated others, the little injustices that went unnoticed, the way the world could feel so unfair sometimes. She'd never been one to speak out, to make waves, but now something inside her had shifted. She started to ask herself, what would I do if I saw something wrong? Would I stand up, like my mom did for me? The next time Mia went to the park, she sat on the same sidewalk where it had all happened. The place no longer felt intimidating. The memories of the officers and the crowd felt distant now, replaced with something new, a sense of empowerment. She was no longer just the girl with a disability, sitting quietly on the curb. She was someone who had survived a moment of injustice and come out stronger on the other side. Over the next few weeks, Maya started to find her voice in small ways. She spoke up when she saw kids being bullied at school. She stood a little taller when someone treated her like she wasn't good enough. And when she saw someone else being picked on or ignored, Maya didn't hesitate. She stepped in, just like her mom had done for her. But the most surprising thing of all came when Maya's mother began to notice the change. One afternoon, as they were walking through the neighborhood, Maya stopped to help an elderly woman carry her groceries. The woman had smiled at her, but there was something else in her eyes, a quiet, unspoken recognition of the kindness that Mia had shown. Mia's mother watched from a distance, a proud smile spreading across her face. She hadn't just taught her daughter to be brave. She had taught her the power of kindness, of standing up for others, and of never letting anyone define her worth. Mia hadn't just learned how to stand up for herself that day. She had learned how to stand for others too. And that, Maya realized, was the true lesson. It wasn't enough to simply stand tall in the face of adversity. It was about using that strength to lift others up. In doing so, she became part of something larger, a community of people who would not tolerate injustice, who would always stand together, no matter the odds. Weeks passed, and life began to settle back into its rhythm. But for Mia, nothing would ever feel quite the same. The lessons of that day stayed with her, etched into her memory in ways she couldn't fully express. It wasn't just about standing up to a couple of officers or facing down an unjust situation. It was about the quiet strength that came with believing in herself, with knowing that her voice, no matter how small, had power. Every time she walked past the park or saw a child being treated unfairly, Mia felt the stirring of something deep inside her, and urged to step forward, to protect the vulnerable, to speak out when silence felt like complicity. It was on one of those days, a Saturday afternoon, that Mia's life would take another unexpected turn. She was sitting outside the local coffee shop with her mother, watching the world go by. It had become their ritual to visit the shop together on weekends, a chance to talk, to laugh, to just be. As they chatted about nothing in particular, a man sitting nearby caught Mia's eye. He was dressed in a well-worn jacket, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes clouded with the weight of the world. He was older, likely in his mid-50s, but what drew Mia's attention wasn't his age. It was the sadness that seemed to hang around him like a dark cloud. Her mother noticed too. "You all right?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm as she looked at him from across the table. The man met her eyes, his face softening for a moment before the mask of weariness returned. "Just been better, that's all," he said, his voice rough with years of unspoken pain. Mia could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind of exhaustion that comes from life's harshest trials, the kind that makes you wonder if you're too tired to keep fighting. Mia's heart stirred. There was something in the way he carried himself, something that reminded her of how she'd felt when she was being interrogated by the officers, small, unnoticed, as if the world was indifferent to your struggles. But Mia had learned something since that day. She had learned that no one deserved to be ignored, that everyone, no matter their circumstances, deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. Without thinking, Mia stood up, her mother watching her closely as she approached the man. "Hi," Mia said, her voice quiet but sincere. "Are you okay?" The man looked up at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, as if something inside him cracked, his face softened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "Not really," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. "Life's been a bit rough lately. Just trying to keep going." Mia sat down next to him, the space between them almost sacred in its simplicity. "I know how that feels," she said softly. "Sometimes it feels like no one cares, like everything's falling apart. But it doesn't have to stay that way." She paused, watching his reaction closely. "I've been through tough stuff too, you know. But you can make it through. It's not easy, but you can make it through." The man looked at her, stunned, his brow furrowing in surprise at the unexpected comfort coming from this young girl. For a moment, Mia could see the weight lift slightly from his shoulders, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. "You've been through tough stuff?" he asked, his voice cautious but curious. Mia nodded, the memories of the confrontation with the officers flashing in her mind. "Yeah," she said simply, "but I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought. That we all are. I used to think I couldn't stand up for myself, but I did. And now I know that no matter what happens, I have the power to change things, even if it's just for one person." Her mother, watching from a distance, smiled softly. She was proud of Mia, but there was something more than pride there. She could see the girl she was becoming, someone who wasn't afraid to step into the world and make it better, even in small, quiet ways. Mia was already becoming a light for others, just as her mother had always hoped she would. The man took a deep breath, his eyes welling up with emotion as he looked at the young girl sitting beside him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't know how much this means to me." Mia didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and smiled. She didn't need to explain that she understood his pain or that she had been where he was. Sometimes, just being there, offering a small gesture of kindness, was enough. Sometimes that was all it took to change someone's day, or even their life. As they sat there, Maya felt something new bloom inside her, a sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of the kind of person she wanted to be. She wasn't just someone who stood up when she was hurt. She was someone who saw others, someone who reached out, and made sure no one felt invisible. In that moment, Maya realized that courage wasn't just about confronting authority or standing up for your own rights. It was also about noticing the pain in others and taking the time to offer a hand, a kind word, or simply a moment of understanding. As the man stood up to leave, he paused for a moment and turned back to Mia. "I'll never forget this," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "You're a good kid. You remind me that there's still some light in the world." Mia smiled, watching him walk away, his steps a little lighter than before. She had made a difference, no matter how small, and that feeling, that quiet, unspoken power, was something that would stay with her forever. Her mother watched, a knowing look on her face as Mia returned to the table, her heart full. "I'm proud of you, Mia," her mother said simply, and Mia knew she meant it. More than anything, Mia knew that she had found something more important than just standing up for herself. She had found the power to make the world a little better, one small act of kindness at a time, and she would never forget that lesson. As the days continued to pass, Mia began to understand the subtle power that came with kindness, the way it could ripple out from a single action, spreading across the lives of others in ways that were impossible to predict. She didn't always see the immediate impact, but she knew it was there. Every time she saw someone struggle, every time she noticed someone in need, there was a voice in her head that urged her to do something, anything, to make things better. She didn't need to be a superhero or someone famous. She just needed to be herself, a girl who cared enough to make a difference in the lives of others. But there were still moments of doubt. The world wasn't always kind, and it wasn't always fair. Mia knew that better than anyone. Even with all the progress she had made, standing up for herself, standing up for others, there were still times when she felt like an outsider. The whispers, the sideways glances, the subtle exclusion, it didn't disappear. Some days, the weight of it all felt heavy, and Mia wondered if she was making any real change at all. But each time that doubt crept in, she thought back to her mother's words, to the strength she had seen in her that day with the officers, to the look of hope in that man's eyes after their brief conversation. She realized that change wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it came in the quiet moments, in the small acts of kindness that no one else might notice. And that, Mia had learned, was enough. It was one crisp autumn morning when Maya's life took another unexpected turn. She had just finished her homework and was heading out to play when she noticed her mother sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at a letter with a furrowed brow. It wasn't unusual for her mother to receive letters, but the look on her face told Mia this one was different. Her mother didn't notice her standing there, so Mia quietly walked over and peered over her shoulder. It was a letter from the school district, one of those formal, official-looking envelopes that had a way of making your stomach twist in knots. "What's that, Mom?" Maya asked, her voice hesitant. Her mother sighed deeply and looked up at Mia, a small smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. "It's a letter about a new initiative of the school," she said, her voice strained. "They're planning to integrate more support for kids with disabilities, but it looks like they're starting with some budget cuts, and guess who they're cutting first?" Mia's heart sank as she listened to her mother's words. For a moment, the room seemed to blur around her. The thought of losing access to the special programs that had helped her, programs that had given her the support she needed to succeed, felt like a gut punch. She knew how hard her mother had fought to get her into those programs, how much work had gone into making sure Mia had the right accommodations to thrive in school. Now, All of that could be in jeopardy, and Maya felt a pang of helplessness wash over her. Her mother placed the letter down and turned to Mia, her expression softening. "I'm going to fight this, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady. But Mia could hear the underlying determination. "We won't let them take away the help you need. You've come so far, and you deserve to keep moving forward. We'll figure this out together." Mia nodded, her eyes still fixed on the letter. She believed her mother. She always did. But a part of her couldn't help but feel the weight of the world pressing down on her again. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for others like her, others who depended on those resources just as much as she did. It was more than just a program. It was their future. And even though Mia had grown stronger, more confident, there were still moments when she felt powerless in the face of something so big. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, Maya thought about everything that had happened, about the officers, the man in the coffee shop, and all the small victories that had made her feel stronger. And now, this new challenge loomed ahead. She could feel the familiar flicker of fear and doubt creeping into her chest. But instead of shrinking away from it, something shifted inside her. She thought about how her mother had fought for her, how she had always stood beside her. And Mia knew what she had to do. She couldn't let fear stop her now, not when it mattered the most. The next day, Mia woke up early and went straight to her mother's room. She found her sitting on the edge of the bed, looking over some paperwork. "Mom," Maya said quietly, "I want to help." Her mother looked up, surprised but touched by the seriousness in Mia's tone. "Help with what, sweetheart?" "With the letter, with the school. I know you're going to fight, but I want to fight too. For me, for everyone who needs these programs." Her mother's eyes softened as she took in Mia's words. "Mia, I don't want you to worry about this. It's a big fight, and I'm handling it." "I know," Maya said, her voice more confident now. "But you've taught me how to stand up for myself. And now I want to help other kids like me. I want to make sure we don't lose what we need to succeed. You don't have to do it alone." Her mother sat back, clearly moved. "Are you sure you're ready for this, sweetie? It's going to be a lot of work." Mia nodded, her resolve clear. "I'm ready. We've been through tough stuff before, right? This is just one more thing we can overcome." For the first time, Mia's mother saw the girl she had raised, not just as her daughter, but as a young woman who had learned to fight for what was right, who had learned to stand up for others, no matter the odds. Mia wasn't just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her mother couldn't have been prouder. Over the next few weeks, Maya threw herself into the cause. She began writing letters to the school board, speaking at meetings, and organizing petitions. She wasn't alone. Her mother, teachers, and classmates rallied behind her. But it was Mia who took the lead, who found the courage to speak up, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. More and more voices joined the fight, and the school board started to listen. The day they received the news that the funding for the programs would be reinstated was one of the proudest moments of Mia's life. Her mother hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it, Mia. We did it." And Mia realized that this fight, like all the others, was about more than just one person. It was about the power of standing together, the power of using your voice to create change. She had learned that courage wasn't just about the big moments. It was about the small steps, the quiet persistence, the refusal to back down even when the world didn't seem to care. As Mia walked through the halls of her school that day, her head held high, she felt something shift inside her, something deeper than just pride. It was the realization that she was part of something larger than herself, a movement of people who refused to stay silent. And in that moment, she knew that no matter what came next, she would always be ready to fight for what was right, to stand up for others, and to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard the road ahead might be. The weeks following their victory felt like a blur to Mia, a whirlwind of emotions and small victories. What started as a personal battle, a fight for the programs that had supported her, had turned into something much larger. something that impacted more than just her. As the news spread throughout the school, more and more students with disabilities came forward, sharing their stories and expressing their gratitude. They all had their own struggles, their own fights, but together, they were stronger than they ever could have been alone. Mia realized that, in the end, it wasn't about the programs or the resources. It was about the people they had brought together. It was about the community they had built, the bonds they had forged through shared struggles and triumphs. In the months that followed, Maya became more than just a student at the school. She became an advocate, a voice for those who had often been overlooked or silenced. She started to organize meetings, sit down with administrators, and find ways to make the school more inclusive, not just for kids with disabilities, but for anyone who felt left out or marginalized. She learned how to speak in front of large groups, how to stand firm even when the opposition seemed overwhelming. She began to realize that she had the power to make real change, not just in her own life, but in the lives of others. It was a power that came from within, from the courage she had found in herself and the support she had received from the people who loved her. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. As Mia's advocacy grew, so did the resistance. There were those who didn't believe in the importance of the programs, those who argued that resources should be allocated elsewhere. There were still moments when Maya felt the sting of exclusion, when she saw the judgment in others' eyes or felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. It wasn't easy, and there were days when she wanted to give up, to retreat into the safety of her old life, where the only battles were the ones she fought in her own head. But each time those thoughts crept in, she thought about the people who had supported her, about the faces of the kids who depended on these programs to succeed. She thought about her mother, who had always believed in her, always pushed her to be better, to be stronger. And she realized that giving up wasn't an option, not anymore. One day, as Mia sat in the library, working on a project for her latest advocacy initiative, she received an unexpected phone call. It was from a woman named Sarah, a local journalist who had heard about Mia's work and wanted to write a feature story about her efforts. Mia was taken aback. She had never imagined her work would be noticed outside of her school, let alone make it to the local news. After a brief conversation, they set up a meeting. And a week later, Maya found herself sitting in a cafe with Sarah, nervously sipping on a cup of tea as the journalist prepared to interview her. Sarah was kind and patient, asking questions that made Maya reflect on everything she had accomplished. "So, Mia," Sarah asked, her voice warm, "what keeps you going? What drives you to keep pushing forward, even when things get tough?" Mia paused, thinking for a moment. She had never really articulated the answer before, but as the words began to form in her mind, she realized that the answer was simple, yet profound. "It's the people who need me," Maya said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to feel like no one cares. But when I see someone else going through the same thing, I know I can help. I know that if I stand up, if I use my voice, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can be the person that someone else needs, just like my mom was for me. I want to be a person who helps others find their strength, the way my mom helped me find mine." Sarah smiled, clearly moved by Mia's words. "You've already made a difference, Mia," she said. "And I think your story is one that will inspire others to do the same." Mia left the interview feeling lighter, more certain of the path she was on. The article, when it was published a few weeks later, was everything she had hoped for and more. It captured her story, her journey from uncertainty to strength, her fight for inclusivity, and her unwavering belief that kindness and perseverance could change the world. The story resonated with so many people. Letters and messages began pouring in from people who had been touched by her words, people who had found inspiration in her courage. Mia had become something she had never imagined, a symbol of hope and strength, not just for those with disabilities, but for anyone who felt like they didn't belong. As the months rolled by, Mia's journey continued to unfold in ways she couldn't have predicted. She was invited to speak at local events, to attend conferences where she could share her story with others who were fighting similar battles. She began to form connections with other young advocates, people her age who were also trying to make the world a better place. Maya realized that the journey she had started, one that began with a simple act of standing up for herself, had turned into something far bigger than she ever imagined. It wasn't just about the programs or the resources. It was about a movement, a community of people who believed that no one should be left behind, that everyone deserved a chance to succeed, to be heard, and to be seen. And through it all, Mia had changed. She had grown into someone who no longer doubted her worth, someone who understood the value of her voice and her actions. She had become the person she had always hoped she would be, the person who made a difference, not just for herself, but for the world around her. Looking back, Mia could see how far she had come. She thought about the girl who had been sitting on the sidewalk, waiting for her mom, unsure of what was happening when the officers approached. She remembered the fear, the confusion, the uncertainty, and she marveled at the strength she had found in herself since then. She realized that it wasn't the world that had changed, it was her. She had learned that even in the face of adversity, even when the odds seemed stacked against her, she had the power to stand up, to speak out, and to make a difference. As Mia continued on her journey, she knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she was ready for them. Because no matter what happened, she would always have her voice, her strength, and her unshakable belief that, together, people could change the world. And that belief was something no one could ever take away from her.